The train whistle cut through the afternoon air like a warning, and Zelda Warren stood on the platform with a carpetbag clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles had gone white, staring at the beast of iron and steam that would carry her away from everything she had ever known in Willits, California, toward a future that promised nothing but emptiness. It was late summer in 1883, and the heat shimmered off the wooden planks of the train station platform, making the distant mountains waver like they were nothing more than a dream. Zelda was 22 years old, and she had spent the last 3 months planning this escape, saving every penny she could from her work at the general store, hiding coins in a tin box beneath a loose floorboard in the room she rented above the millinery shop. Her father had died 2 years ago, thrown from a horse while working a ranch 30 miles south. Her mother had followed him 6 months later, her heart simply giving up one morning as she sat in her rocking chair, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Zelda had no siblings, no aunts or uncles who claimed her, no sweetheart waiting with promises of forever. She had decided, in the quiet loneliness of too many empty evenings, that if she was going to be alone, she might as well be alone somewhere new. The destination on her ticket read Sacramento, but even that felt like a lie. Sacramento was just another stop, another place where she would know no one and nothing. She had picked it because the ticket was affordable, and because it was far enough away that she would not be tempted to turn around and come back. Nowhere, she thought. She was going nowhere, Miss Warren. The voice came from behind her, low and urgent, and she turned to find Samuel Blake standing there, his hat in his hands, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than his 26 years. He was dusty from the trail, his boots worn but well kept, his shirt open at the collar in a way that showed the sun-browned skin of his throat. He worked as a ranch hand at the Morrison spread just outside town, a man who knew horses and cattle and the kind of hard work that built calluses and character in equal measure. Zelda had seen him around Willits, had exchanged pleasantries at the general store when he came in for supplies, had noticed the way his eyes lingered on her just a moment too long before he tipped his hat and moved on. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice catching in her throat. She had not expected anyone to notice her leaving, had not said goodbye to anyone because she did not think anyone would care. "You are boarding that train," he said, and it was not a question. His eyes moved from her face to the carpetbag in her hands, to the ticket she held folded between her fingers. "I am," she said, lifting her chin. "I have no reason to stay." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage that clung to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. They were the color of good whiskey, amber and warm, and there was something in them that made her heart stutter in her chest. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Sacramento," she said, though the word felt hollow even as she spoke it, and then she hesitated. "I do not know, somewhere, anywhere." "Nowhere," he said softly, and the word hung between them like a judgment. "You are going nowhere." "What does it matter to you?" she asked, and there was more heat in her voice than she had intended. "I am nothing to you, a stranger you have spoken to maybe a dozen times." "That is not true," he said, and his voice was rough now, almost angry. "You think I have not noticed you. You think I have not watched you walking through town with your head held high even when I could see the sadness in your eyes. You think I have not wanted to say something, to do something, but held back because I am just a ranch hand with nothing to offer." The train whistle blew again, sharper this time, a 2-minute warning. Passengers were beginning to board, their voices rising in a chorus of farewells and hurried instructions. "I have to go," Zelda said, but her feet did not move. "Nowhere is lonely," Samuel said, and he reached out, his hand closing gently around her wrist. His touch was warm, careful, as though he was afraid she might shatter. "Stay with me." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "Then let me," he said. "Let me know you. Let me show you that you are not alone, that you do not have to run away to some distant city where no one will see you, where no one will care if you live or die. Stay here. Stay with me." "Why?" The question was barely audible, lost in the hiss of steam from the train, in the shuffle of feet on the platform. "Why do you care?" "Because I have been lonely too," he said, and there was such raw honesty in his voice that it made her eyes sting with tears she refused to let fall. "Because I know what it is like to feel like you are invisible, like you do not matter. Because the first time I saw you, you were helping old Mr. Chen carry his groceries back to his laundry, and you were laughing at something he said, and I thought you had the most beautiful smile I had ever seen. Because every time I have seen you since, I have wanted to talk to you, really talk to you, but I did not know how. Because I am a fool who is terrified that if I let you get on that train, I will regret it for the rest of my life." The conductor called out the final boarding warning, his voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. Zelda looked at the train, at the open door waiting to swallow her up and carry her away, and then she looked back at Samuel, at the hope and fear warring in his eyes. "I have nothing," she said. "No family, no money beyond what I saved for this ticket. I rent a room above the millinery shop and I work at the general store 6 days a week. What kind of life is that?" "A life," Samuel said simply. "A life that could be more if you let it, if you let me try to make it more." "You are asking me to stay for a man I barely know," she said, but even as she spoke, she could feel something shifting inside her, some locked door beginning to creak open. "I am asking you to stay for yourself," he said, "to give yourself a chance, to give us a chance. I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow or to promise me anything. I am asking you to stay, to let me court you properly, to see if what I feel when I look at you might be something you could feel too." The train began to move, just a few inches at first, the wheels groaning against the tracks. If she was going to board, it had to be now. Zelda looked down at the ticket in her hand, at the carefully printed letters that spelled out a destination she did not truly want. And then she looked back at Samuel, at this man who had appeared out of nowhere to offer her something she had not dared to hope for. She let the ticket fall from her fingers, watched it flutter to the platform like a white moth, and said, "All right." The relief that flooded his face was so profound that it made her breath catch. "All right," he repeated, as though he could not quite believe what he had heard. "All right," she said again, and this time she smiled, a small, tentative thing, but real. "I will stay. I will give us a chance." He did not grab her, did not pull her into an embrace that would have been improper for a public platform in the bright light of day. Instead, he simply took her carpetbag from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, and said, "Thank you." They stood there for a moment, watching the train pull away, carrying with it the life Zelda had thought she wanted, the escape she had planned so carefully. And then Samuel turned to her and said, "Can I walk you back to town? Maybe buy you a cup of coffee at the hotel restaurant?" "I would like that," Zelda said, and they began to walk, side by side, back toward Willits. The town was small but bustling, built in the valley where redwood forests met open ranchland, a place where loggers and ranchers and farmers all mingled in the streets and saloons. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with wooden buildings painted in optimistic colors that the sun and wind had faded to gentler shades. The general store where Zelda worked stood on the corner, its windows crowded with displays of canned goods and bolts of fabric. Across the street was the saloon, the hotel, the blacksmith shop with its open doors and the constant ring of hammer on anvil. It was not a grand place, not a city with theaters and museums and electric lights, but it was alive, vital, full of people who knew each other's names and stories. "Tell me about yourself," Samuel said as they walked. "Tell me something I do not know." Zelda thought about it, trying to find some piece of herself that felt worth sharing. "I wanted to be a teacher when I was younger," she said finally. "I loved school, loved reading. But my father needed help on the ranch after my mother got sick the first time, and then there was no money for more schooling, and then everything just fell apart." "You could still be a teacher," Samuel said. "Willits does not have a proper school yet, just Mrs. Henderson teaching children in her front room. The town council has been talking about building a real schoolhouse, hiring a real teacher." "I do not have the qualifications," Zelda said. "You have more education than half the people in this town," Samuel countered, "and you have a good heart. That counts for something." She glanced at him, surprised by his faith in her. "What about you? Have you always been a ranch hand?" "My whole life," he said. "My father worked ranches in Texas, moved the family to California when I was 12. He taught me everything about horses and cattle, how to read the weather and the land. He died 5 years ago, caught pneumonia one winter, and never recovered. My mother remarried a man in Oregon, moved up there with my younger sisters. I stayed here because I liked the work, liked the country. You see them, your mother and sisters, not often enough," he admitted. "I write letters, send money when I can. But it is a long journey, and ranch work does not leave much time for traveling." They reached the hotel, a 2-story building with a wide porch and rocking chairs where old men sat and watched the world go by. The restaurant was a simple affair, a dozen tables covered in checkered cloths, the smell of coffee and fresh bread filling the air. Samuel held the door for Zelda, and they chose a table by the window where they could watch the street. A woman named Maeve, who had worked at the hotel for as long as anyone could remember, brought them coffee in thick ceramic mugs and slices of apple pie that were still warm from the oven. "Good to see you, Samuel," she said, and then her eyes moved to Zelda with open curiosity. "And you, Miss Warren, I heard you were leaving town today." "Plans changed," Zelda said, feeling her cheeks warm. Maeve's smile was knowing. "Sometimes the best plans are the ones that do not happen," she said, and she left them to their coffee and pie. Samuel wrapped his hands around his mug, his eyes serious. "I meant what I said on the platform. I want to court you properly. I want to take you to church socials and town dances. I want to bring you flowers and walk you home in the evenings. I want to know everything about you, what makes you laugh, what makes you sad, what you dream about when you cannot sleep." Zelda felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "That sounds nice," she said quietly. "But I need you to understand. I am not some fragile thing that needs saving. I was not running away because I am weak. I was running because I was tired of being invisible, tired of feeling like I did not matter to anyone." "You matter," Samuel said, and the intensity in his voice made her believe him. "You matter to me, and I think if you give this town a chance, you will find you matter to more people than you realize." Over the next few weeks, Samuel made good on his promise. He courted Zelda with a patience and attentiveness that surprised her, showing up at the general store at the end of her shifts to walk her home, bringing her wildflowers he had picked on the trail, inviting her to join him for dinners at the hotel or picnics by the river that ran through the valley. He introduced her to his friends, to the other ranch hands and the families he worked for, and slowly, Zelda began to see Willits not as the place she had wanted to escape, but as a community she could belong to. One Saturday evening, there was a dance at the town hall, a simple affair with a fiddle player and a guitar, the floorboards creaking under the weight of stomping boots and swirling skirts. Samuel arrived at Zelda's door wearing a clean shirt and a nervous smile, and when he offered her his arm, she took it without hesitation. The hall was crowded, filled with the smell of sweat and perfume, and the sharp tang of whiskey from the flasks the men passed around outside. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm golden light over everything. Samuel led Zelda onto the dance floor, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, and they moved together to the music, a waltz that was fast and joyful and a little chaotic. "You are a good dancer," Zelda said, surprised. "My mother insisted," Samuel said, grinning. "She said no son of hers would grow up not knowing how to dance with a lady." "Remind me to thank her if I ever meet her," Zelda said, and Samuel laughed, spinning her in a circle that made her skirt flare out around her legs. They danced until they were both breathless and flushed, until Zelda's feet ached in her good shoes and Samuel's shirt was damp with sweat. And then they stepped outside into the cool night air, walking away from the noise and light of the hall, down the quiet street toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open fields, and the stars were so thick overhead they looked like spilled sugar. "I am glad you stayed," Samuel said, his voice soft in the darkness. "So am I," Zelda said, and she meant it. She looked up at him at the way the moonlight caught in his eyes and felt her heart beat faster. "I was so afraid that day, afraid of staying, afraid of leaving. But you made me see that being afraid is not a reason to run." "We are all afraid sometimes," Samuel said, "but it is easier when you do not have to face it alone." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin in a touch so gentle it made her shiver. "Zelda," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "Can I kiss you?" she nodded, not trusting her voice, and he leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. It was not her first kiss, but it felt like everything before this moment had been practice for something real. When they finally pulled apart, she was trembling, her hands fisted in the fabric of his shirt. "I think I am falling in love with you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Good," Samuel said, his forehead resting against hers, "because I am already in love with you." The weeks turned into months and the courtship deepened into something more profound. Samuel and Zelda became a familiar sight in Willits, walking together in the evenings, sitting side by side at church on Sundays, laughing over shared meals at the hotel restaurant. The townspeople watched with approval, pleased to see two lonely souls finding comfort in each other. Mr. Morrison, the rancher Samuel worked for, even offered Samuel a raise and a small cabin on the property, a place of his own where he could build a life. It was late autumn when Samuel proposed, the air crisp with the promise of winter, the leaves on the few deciduous trees turning gold and red. He took Zelda on a ride out to a place he loved, a meadow high in the hills where you could see for miles, where the redwoods stood like silent sentinels, and the grass was soft beneath their feet. He spread a blanket and they sat together, sharing bread and cheese and apples, talking about everything and nothing. And then he took her hand, his eyes serious, and said, "Zelda Warren, I know we have only known each other a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. You make me want to be better, to work harder, to build a future worth living. Will you marry me?" He pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in the center, the stone the color of wine in the sunlight. It had belonged to his grandmother, he explained, given to him by his mother before she moved to Oregon, held onto for the day when he found someone worth giving it to. Zelda looked at the ring, at Samuel's hopeful, anxious face, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly as though it had been made for her. And then he kissed her, deep and passionate, a kiss that spoke of all the tomorrows they would share, and Zelda felt something inside her finally settle, finally come home. They were married in early December, a small ceremony in the town's only church, with Maeve and a few other friends standing witness. Zelda wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple but beautiful, made of cream-colored fabric she had bought at a discount from the general store. Samuel wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his hands shaking just a little as he slipped a second ring onto Zelda's finger, a wedding band to match the engagement ring. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of faith. And then he pronounced them husband and wife, and Samuel kissed Zelda in front of God and everyone, and the small crowd erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the hotel, Maeve organizing a feast of roasted chicken and potatoes and vegetables, pies and cakes brought by women from the town who wanted to celebrate the union. There was music and dancing, toasts made with glasses of wine and whiskey, laughter and joy filling the room until late into the night. And then, finally, Samuel and Zelda left the hotel and walked through the quiet streets to the cabin Samuel had prepared for them, a small but sturdy structure made of wood and stone, with a fireplace and a bed and a table and chairs. He had spent weeks getting it ready, painting the walls, building shelves, making it a home. He carried her over the threshold, a tradition he insisted on despite her protests that it was old-fashioned, and set her down gently in the center of the room. The fire was already burning in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, filling the space with warmth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blake," Samuel said, and Zelda smiled, loving the sound of her new name. "It is perfect," she said, looking around at the simple furnishings, the care that had gone into every detail. "You are perfect." He pulled her close, his hands at her waist, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both tender and hungry. They had waited, respecting the proprieties of courtship, and now there was no need to wait any longer. He led her to the bed, and they came together as husband and wife, their bodies learning each other in the flickering firelight, whispered words of love and need filling the space between kisses and sighs. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, Zelda's head on Samuel's chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I cannot believe I almost left," she said quietly. "I cannot believe I almost got on that train and gave this up." "Fate," Samuel said. "It had to be fate that brought me to the station that day. I almost did not go. I had work to do, but something told me I needed to be there. And there you were, looking so lost and so brave at the same time, and I knew I could not let you leave." "My hero," Zelda teased, but there was no mockery in her voice, only affection. "Always," Samuel promised, and he kissed the top of her head. The winter was mild that year, rain more common than snow in the valley, and Samuel and Zelda settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Samuel continued to work at the Morrison Ranch, his days long and hard, but he always came home to Zelda, to the warmth of the cabin and the smell of whatever she had cooked for dinner. Zelda kept working at the general store for a while, saving money toward their future, but she also began to pursue her old dream of teaching. She approached Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had been teaching children in her front room, and offered to help. Mrs. Henderson, who was getting older and finding it harder to manage a classroom full of energetic children, accepted gratefully. Zelda started by assisting a few hours a week, and then, as her confidence grew, she took on more responsibility. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, geography and science, her love of learning infectious. The town council, hearing of her work, approached her about becoming the official teacher when they finally built a schoolhouse. It would not be much pay, they warned, but it would be steady, and it would be important work. Zelda accepted without hesitation, her dream finally within reach. The schoolhouse was completed in the spring of 1884, a one-room building with big windows that let in the light, rows of desks for the students, and a blackboard at the front. Zelda stood in the empty room on the day before classes were set to begin, looking around at the space that would be hers, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. If she had gotten on that train, she would never have known this, would never have had this chance to make a difference. Samuel found her there, standing by the window, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am happy," she said simply. "Happier than I ever thought I could be." "Me too," Samuel said, and he turned her in his arms so he could kiss her, long and slow, a kiss that spoke of all the love he felt for her. The school year began, and Zelda threw herself into the work, teaching children of all ages, from 6-year-olds just learning their letters to 14-year-olds preparing to leave school and join the workforce. She was patient and kind, but firm when she needed to be, and the children responded to her with affection and respect. Parents praised her, grateful for the education their children were receiving, and Zelda felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. Samuel was proud of her, talking about her accomplishments to anyone who would listen. He worked hard at the ranch, saving money, planning for the future. He talked about buying land of his own someday, starting a small ranch where he could raise cattle and horses, build a life that was entirely theirs. Zelda encouraged him, believing in his dreams as much as he believed in hers. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sun set behind the mountains, Zelda took Samuel's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice soft with wonder. Samuel looked at her, his eyes widening as understanding dawned. "Are you?" "I am," she said, smiling through the tears that were suddenly streaming down her face. "We are going to have a baby." He let out a whoop of joy that startled the birds from the nearby trees, and then he was on his feet, pulling her up with him, spinning her around in a circle before setting her down carefully, as though she were made of glass. "A baby," he said, his voice full of awe. "We are going to have a baby." "In the spring," Zelda said. "April, I think." He kissed her, deep and passionate, and then he knelt down, pressing his forehead against her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your papa, and I already love you more than you can imagine." The pregnancy was not easy. Zelda suffered from sickness in the early months, struggling to keep food down, exhausted in a way that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. She had to cut back her hours at the school, handing some of her responsibilities back to Mrs. Henderson, and it frustrated her, this feeling of weakness, of her body betraying her. But Samuel was there, constant and steady, bringing her dry toast and ginger tea, rubbing her back when the nausea was at its worst, holding her when she cried from sheer exhaustion. "You are not weak," he told her over and over. "You are growing a person. That is the strongest thing anyone can do." As the months passed, her body changed, her belly swelling, her breasts growing heavy, her ankles swelling by the end of each day. She felt ungainly and awkward, but Samuel looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He talked to the baby every night, his hand on her stomach, telling stories about his day, singing off-key lullabies that made Zelda laugh despite her discomfort. Winter came, colder than the year before, with frost on the ground in the mornings and ice forming on the edges of the river. Zelda stayed close to the cabin, venturing out only when necessary, bundled in layers of clothing that barely fit over her swollen belly. Samuel worried about her constantly, checking on her throughout the day, bringing home supplies so she would not have to go into town. And then, on a rainy evening in early April, the pains began. Zelda was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when the first contraction hit, a tightening across her belly that took her breath away. She gripped the edge of the table, waiting for it to pass, and then called for Samuel, who was outside chopping wood. He came running, his face pale when he saw the expression on hers. "Is it time?" he asked, and she nodded, another contraction already building. He helped her to the bed, then ran to fetch the midwife, a woman named Clara who lived on the edge of town. By the time they returned, Zelda's contractions were coming faster, harder, and she was gripping the bedsheets, trying to breathe through the pain. Clara took charge, her voice calm and confident, instructing Samuel to boil water, to bring clean towels to stay out of the way. But Samuel refused to leave Zelda's side, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, his eyes bright with tears every time she cried out in pain. The labor lasted through the night, long hours of agony that felt like they would never end. Zelda had never known pain like this, a force that consumed her entire body, that made her feel like she was being torn apart. But Clara kept telling her she was doing well, that the baby was coming, and Samuel kept holding her hand, kept telling her he loved her, and somehow she found the strength to keep going. And then, as the first light of dawn was breaking through the windows, there was a final, overwhelming push, and the baby was born, sliding into Clara's waiting hands with a loud, indignant wail. "It is a boy," Clara announced, holding up the squirming, red-faced infant. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Zelda collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and shaking, but smiling through her tears. Samuel was crying openly now, his hand still gripping hers, his eyes fixed on the baby as Clara cleaned him and wrapped him in a soft blanket. "You want to hold him?" Clara asked, and Samuel nodded, accepting the bundle with trembling hands. He carried the baby to Zelda, placing him carefully in her arms, and she looked down at her son, at his tiny face and his dark hair and his perfect little fingers, and felt her heart expand until it felt like it might burst. "Hello, my love," she whispered. "I am your mama." Samuel sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Zelda, his eyes never leaving the baby. "He is perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What should we name him?" They had talked about names, but nothing had felt quite right. Now, looking at her son, Zelda said, "Thomas, Thomas Samuel Blake." Samuel smiled, kissing her temple. "Thomas," he repeated. "I like that. Welcome to the world, Thomas." The early days of parenthood were exhausting and overwhelming and wonderful all at once. Thomas was a fussy baby, crying at all hours, demanding to be fed and changed and held constantly. Zelda, still recovering from the birth, struggled with the exhaustion, with the feeling that she was failing at something that should come naturally. But Samuel was there, taking over whenever he could, walking the floor with Thomas in the middle of the night, changing diapers and heating bottles when Zelda could not produce enough milk. Slowly, they found their rhythm. Thomas began to sleep for longer stretches, his cries becoming less frequent, his smiles more common. Zelda healed, her body slowly returning to something that felt like her own. And Samuel fell completely in love with fatherhood, his days now bookended by time with his son. Mornings spent holding Thomas while Zelda made breakfast, evenings spent playing with him on a blanket on the floor. When Thomas was 3 months old, Zelda returned to the school part-time, bringing the baby with her in a basket that she set near her desk. The children were fascinated by him, begging to hold him during breaks, and Thomas, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention, gurgling and cooing at his audience. The months passed, and Thomas grew, learning to roll over, to sit up, to crawl. He was a curious, adventurous child, getting into everything, keeping Zelda and Samuel constantly on their toes. But he was also sweet and affectionate, his face lighting up whenever they entered the room, his laughter the best sound either of them had ever heard. On Thomas's first birthday, they threw a small party at the cabin, inviting friends from town, Maeve and Clara and Mr. Morrison and some of the other ranch hands. There was cake and lemonade, presents wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Thomas, overwhelmed by all the attention, cried and then fell asleep in Samuel's arms, his face sticky with frosting. He had a good day, Zelda said that evening, watching as Samuel laid their sleeping son in his crib. The best, Samuel agreed, wrapping his arms around her. Thank you. For what? She asked, confused. For staying, he said. For giving us a chance. For building this life with me. I know it has not always been easy, but I would not trade a single moment of it. Neither would I, Zelda said, and she kissed him, slow and deep, pouring all her love into it. They made love that night, quietly so as not to wake Thomas, and afterward, as they lay tangled together, Samuel said, "Do you ever think about that day at the train station? About what would have happened if you had gotten on that train?" "Sometimes," Zelda admitted. "I think about how different my life would be, how empty, how lonely." "Nowhere is lonely," Samuel said, echoing the words he had spoken to her that day. "But I am not nowhere," Zelda said, smiling. "I am here, with you, and that is everywhere that matters." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. When Thomas was 2, Zelda became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. She gave birth to a daughter in the winter of 1887, a tiny, dark-haired girl they named Rose. Thomas, initially suspicious of this new addition, quickly became fiercely protective of his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to feedings. Samuel continued to work at the Morrison Ranch, but he also began to save in earnest, his dream of owning his own land growing more tangible. Mr. Morrison, who had no children of his own, had grown fond of Samuel, and when he passed away in 1889, he left a portion of his land to Samuel in his will. 100 acres on the northern edge of the property, good grazing land with a creek running through it. Samuel was overwhelmed by the gift, by the trust and affection it represented. He immediately began making plans, working with Zelda to design a house they would build on the land, a larger place with room for their growing family, and for the future they were building together. The house took 2 years to complete, built with the help of friends and neighbors, a sturdy 2-story structure with a wide porch and big windows that let in the light. They moved in the spring of 1891, Thomas now 7 years old and Rose 4, both of them wild with excitement over the new space, the land to explore, the animals Samuel was already beginning to acquire. Zelda continued to teach, though she cut back her hours to focus on her own children, on helping Samuel build the ranch. She taught Thomas and Rose at home, instilling in them her love of learning, her belief in the power of education. Samuel worked from dawn until dusk, building fences, tending cattle, breaking horses, his body lean and strong from the labor, his face creased with lines from squinting into the sun. They were happy. It was not always easy. There were hard years when the rain did not come and the cattle died, years when money was tight and they had to make difficult choices. But they faced it together, Samuel and Zelda, partners in every sense of the word, their love deepening with each passing year. In 1895, Zelda gave birth to their third child, another boy they named Henry. He was a quiet, thoughtful child, content to sit and watch the world around him, his eyes taking in everything. Thomas and Rose adored him, fighting over who got to hold him, who got to make him laugh. Samuel was 40 years old now, his hair beginning to gray at the temples, his body bearing the scars and calluses of decades of hard work. But he was still strong, still vital, and when he looked at Zelda, at their children, at the life they had built, he felt nothing but gratitude. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, the children playing in the yard, Zelda said, "Do you remember what you said to me that day at the train station?" "Every word," Samuel said. "You said nowhere is lonely," Zelda said. "And you were right. But what you gave me was not just an escape from loneliness. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Samuel corrected gently. "I was just as lost as you were, Zelda, just as lonely. You saved me as much as I saved you." She leaned her head on his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat there in comfortable silence, watching their children play, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. "I love you," Zelda said. "I love you too," Samuel replied. "Always have, always will." The years continued to unfold, each one a chapter in the story of their lives. Thomas grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, with a gift for working with horses. He left home at 18 to work on a ranch in Montana, promising to write, to visit. Rose became a teacher like her mother, taking over the school in Willits when Zelda finally retired. Henry, the quiet one, surprised everyone by developing a passion for music, learning to play the fiddle and the guitar, performing at town dances and gatherings. Samuel and Zelda grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down. But they were still together, still in love, still partners. They sat on the porch in the evenings, holding hands, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had built. In the summer of 1910, they celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary, surrounded by family and friends. Thomas had come home from Montana with his wife and 2 children. Rose was there with her husband and their baby daughter. Henry played music, his fingers flying over the strings of his fiddle, filling the air with joy. Zelda looked around at all the people gathered, at the life that had grown from that single moment on a train platform in 1883, and felt tears of happiness slide down her cheeks. Samuel, sitting beside her, squeezed her hand and whispered, "What are you thinking?" "That I am the luckiest woman in the world," she said. "That I almost threw this all away because I was too scared to believe I deserved it." "You deserved it," Samuel said. "You deserved all of it and more." "So did you," Zelda said, and she kissed him, soft and sweet, in front of everyone, not caring who saw. As the sun set and the party continued around them, Samuel and Zelda slipped away, walking hand in hand through the fields they had worked together, past the house they had built, down to the creek that ran through their land. The water was cool and clear, running over smooth stones, and they sat on the bank, their feet dangling in the current. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked. "Staying, I mean, giving up whatever life you might have had in Sacramento or wherever you ended up." "Never," Zelda said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You were right, Samuel. Nowhere would have been lonely. But here, with you, I have been everywhere that matters. I have been home." They sat there until the stars came out, until the sounds of the party faded and the night grew quiet around them. And then they walked back to the house together, to the family waiting for them, to the life they had built from a single act of faith on a train platform so many years ago. Samuel passed away in the winter of 1923, his heart giving out quietly in his sleep, Zelda beside him. He was 66 years old, a good age for a man who had worked as hard as he had. Zelda grieved deeply, the loss of her partner, her love, leaving a hole in her heart that never fully healed. But she was surrounded by her children and grandchildren, by the legacy they had built together, and she found comfort in that. She lived another 12 years, passing away peacefully in 1935 at the age of 74, in the house Samuel had built for her, surrounded by family. Her last words were his name, whispered like a prayer, like a promise. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery on the edge of Willits, their graves marked by simple stone markers that bore their names and the dates of their births and deaths. But their real legacy was not in stone. It was in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that still bore the Blake name, in the school where Rose still taught, in the music Henry still played. It was in the story that was told and retold of the cowboy who stopped a woman from boarding a train to nowhere, who said to her, "Nowhere is lonely, stay with me," and who changed both their lives forever. And in that story, in the love that had grown from a single moment of courage and faith, Samuel and Zelda Blake lived on, their love a testament to the power of taking a chance, of choosing hope over fear, of believing that even in the loneliest moments, connection is possible, and that home is not a place but a person, a choice, a promise kept. The town of Willits continued to grow and change over the decades, but the Blake family remained a fixture, their story woven into the fabric of the community. Thomas's children took over the ranch, expanding it, modernizing it while still honoring the traditions their grandparents had established. Rose's daughter became a teacher, continuing the family legacy of education. Henry's music was passed down to his children and grandchildren, his songs still played at town gatherings, a living memory of the man who had learned to find joy in simple things. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the sun was setting over the valley and the air was filled with the scent of sage and grass, people swore they could see two figures walking hand in hand through the fields, a cowboy and his wife, forever bound by a love that had begun with 3 simple words, "Stay with me." The story of Samuel and Zelda Blake became a legend in Willits, told to children at bedtime, shared at town meetings, written about in local histories. It was a story of love and faith, of second chances and the courage to take them. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones where we choose to stay, to fight, to believe, even when it would be easier to run. And at the heart of it all was that single moment on a train platform in 1883, when a lonely woman with a ticket to nowhere met a cowboy who saw her, truly saw her, and refused to let her disappear. He had offered her his heart, his life, his promise of a future that neither of them could have imagined. And she had taken it, had chosen hope over despair, had chosen love over loneliness. It was a choice that echoed through generations, a choice that built a family, a legacy, a life worth living. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, but the quiet, everyday choice to stay, to love, to build something beautiful out of the raw materials of 2 lonely hearts and a whole lot of faith. Samuel Blake had been right that day on the platform. Nowhere was lonely, but somewhere with the right person could be everything, and for him and Zelda it had been. It had been home, it had been family, it had been love in its purest, most enduring form. It had been a life well lived, a story well told, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. And so the story ends, not with tragedy or loss, but with the simple, profound truth that love, real love, the kind that lasts a lifetime, begins not with a grand declaration but with a simple invitation. Stay with me. And when the right person says yes, when they choose to stay, to take that leap of faith, everything becomes possible. Everything becomes real. Everything becomes, finally, truly home.